to the prosecution. Instead, they all insisted that McManus was a good sport, and not the type to take revenge on someone over them not paying their debts. In fact, even the state's best witness, Marion Putnam, would have her reputation called into question by the defense, as they revealed to the jury the shocking revelation that Marion Putnam had not been sharing her hotel room with a Mr. Putnam, or even with a man she intended to marry. Scandalous behavior that was apparently not uncommon for Marion. McManus's lawyers also damaged her reputation for the 1920s-era jury by intimating that Marion ran a roadside speakeasy and may have even been caught shoplifting a few dresses in Asheville. Then, with her reputation thus damaged, Marion was said to have been so rattled that she could no longer say with any confidence which room the wounded man she had seen had come from, or even from where the sound of raised voices and something breaking had come from either, which ultimately meant the prosecution could not prove where Rothstein had been shot. As such, they could not tie McManus's coat and handkerchief to the crime either, seeing as how Rothstein could have theoretically come from any of the rooms on that floor. In fact, the state did such a poor job in proving that George McManus was responsible for the murder of Arnold Rothstein that Judge Knott on the 5th of December ordered the jury to acquit McManus due to the state failing to establish its case. For many, though, all this meant was that George McManus had gotten away with murder. Titanic, though, as he would later confide in those he trusted, remained convinced that it was actually McManus's henchman Jilly Biller who had pulled the trigger and subsequently fled to Havana avoiding prosecution. Regardless, the individual who would seemingly pay the greatest price for the murder of Arnold Rothstein was Titanic himself, as even though he wasn't actually charged with any crime in connection to the shooting, the trial and his appearance in it effectively raised his national profile, which meant it would be now much harder for him to show up at some place and be this anonymous figure who just happened to have this penchant for gambling, as now, thanks to the very public trial, his picture had been in papers all over the place, especially in the Northeast. Plus, the prosecutor had made a point of making sure that the jury and everyone in attendance knew that the witness was a high-stakes gambler known for playing golf and poker. In fact, they even got Titanic to admit that when he played, the odds were always more or less in his favor, as when asked if poker was a game of chance, Titanic testified, quote, "Not the way I play it." Titanic Thompson, as he became known due to the papers getting his last name wrong, was now much more of a known quantity, which, as I said, hurt his ability to catch people unaware and get them to make foolish bets. Titanic, you see, had always relied on making people overconfident, and that was going to be much harder to do if people realized they were dealing with an expert gambler and conman. After all, the whole point of being a traveling gambler of his type was to remain anonymous, so their marks wouldn't be suspicious. Simply put, it's harder to set people up if they realize the person they're dealing with is trying to manipulate them. That was why traveling was so important, and why that way of life fit Titanic Thompson, who seemed to naturally not like staying in one place for too long, as by staying constantly on the move, he was able to consistently find a new supply of people who A, had money, and B, were not on their guard for him and his tricks. At this point, Titanic Thompson had more or less exhausted his opportunities in Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. He had become much more of a known commodity in those locales, and thus people were less willing to bet large sums of money in anything he was involved in, as they suspected he likely had some trick up his sleeve. The publicity from the Rothstein murder trial didn't help matters either, as now his picture had appeared in papers at the very least all across the Northeast, if not across the country. A picture that was invariably accompanied by information that he was a gambler of some fame. In fact, it would not be long before Titanic saw the first consequences of his newfound fame, as he was arrested and jailed on New Year's Day in Little Rock, Arkansas, on the charge of illegal gambling, or as the city's chief of police put it, for, quote, "making golf too expensive for members of our local country club." Now, this jail sentence in and of itself wasn't a huge deal, as it was only for a day with a warning to get out of town. It was, though, a sign that his reputation had started to spread far and wide. Still, though, this would not be the end of the road for Titanic Thompson, not by a long shot. Unfortunately, while in jail, the traveling gambler would receive far worse news. News that back in Pittsburgh, his wife Alice, who was visiting her parents, had been fatally struck by a car. Now, the degree to which Titanic grieved this loss, if he even did, is unknown. Indeed, one of my sources even claimed the two had actually discussed getting divorced, as Alice understandably grew tired of being left out of her husband's life for long stretches, and always seemed to be second to whatever new scheme he was cooking up at the time. In fact, the same source claimed that while Alice had bailed her husband out when he was arrested in New York, she reportedly told him to not expect her to come rushing to his aid again. With that being said, his later wife suspected that Alice was the only one of them that he ever truly loved. Claims that aren't mutually exclusive, as Titanic may have actually loved Alice in his own way, but she still could have grown tired of constantly being ignored by him. The extent of Titanic's personal grief aside, the whole country was soon experiencing its own tough times as it moved into the next decade, as the combination of the Wall Street crash and cascading bank failures across the country effectively wiped out the life savings of many. The Great Depression then was soon in full effect, but there were still people out there that had so much money, they were able to wager it recklessly, and as such, Titanic Thompson still had people he could take advantage of. So in 1932, Titanic headed to Tyler, Texas, which was enjoying the benefits of having highly productive oil fields nearby. Notably, as the 39-year-old Titanic Thompson arrived in town, he was accompanied by two young women, Yvonne and Joanne Rainey, who were 17 and 15 respectively. It seems quite likely that 17-year-old Yvonne had caught Titanic's eye, as despite the years going by, the women he targeted remained the same age as they always had, which wasn't of much note when he was in his teens and early 20s, but now as he was approaching his 40s and throughout the rest of his life, you'll note the women he gets involved with all tend to be about 17 years old when they meet. He had apparently first encountered Yvonne in Benton, Kansas, and invited her along for a car ride that she only agreed to if her 15-year-old sister Joanne could accompany them. Upon arriving in Tyler, Texas, Titanic dropped the sisters off at a local hotel and proceeded to go hunting for prospects in town, which of course included checking out the local golf course. After looking the course over, the traveling gambler then got to talking with the club's professional one, Jimmy Haynes. As they spoke, Titanic said it looked like a nice course, albeit he thought it looked to be a little on the easy side. The way he figured it, this was the kind of course where it wouldn't be all that hard to get a good score on. Now, Jimmy as the course pro naturally disagreed, saying that he played here almost daily, and in his expert opinion, it was plenty challenging. Indeed, in his estimation, the very idea that someone could come here and get the kind of score that Titanic was predicting their first time out was ludicrous. This led to a bit of a back and forth between the two men, that may or may not have included Jimmy recognizing the figure he was dealing with, or at the very least figuring that the other man was probably a fairly skilled golfer and gambling type. Still, even with this knowledge, the course pro was confident that regardless of the stranger's skill level, there was no way he was going to be able to match the score he predicted the first time out. Jimmy was so confident he was willing to bet $500 to that effect. So Titanic at random picked a young caddy to hold the $500 they each were wagering on this game, and then they all headed out on the course. In the end, as you might expect, Titanic won the bet, but he did not do so through any kind of trickery. He was reportedly just that good of a golfer that he could show up at a random golf course and beat the course pro without even having to cheat. Titanic then claimed his $1,000 from the wide-eyed caddy who might never have seen that much money in one place, especially now with the Great Depression setting in. The roving gambler then tipped the lad $20 and laughed when the young man asked him why he didn't join the pro tour, to which Titanic was said to respond something along the lines of the pro tour didn't pay well enough. Now, all in all, this had just been another day in the life of Titanic Thompson. That night, however, as he was in his hotel room with the young Rainey sisters, they were disturbed by the sound of his Pierce Arrow's horn echoing in the night air. At this, Titanic leapt into action, knowing the sound meant someone was trying to steal his car. As you see, the quite expensive vehicle had been rigged up with a primitive alarm system. So Titanic grabbed his .45 and marched out into the darkness. Yet, by the time he reached the location where his car was parked, the horn's blaring had ceased. The gambler then stood there for a few moments on guard, but when there didn't seem to be any further signs of disturbance, the tall, lean man moved to head back to the hotel. Before he took more than a step, however, a voice from the darkness called out, ordering him to put his hands up or they would shoot. Titanic ignored this order and instead instantly whirled around, pulling his gun in the process. He then dropped to one knee and took aim at a figure in the darkness, who he could just make out was wearing a ski mask and was holding a gun. Titanic Thompson then fired 4 shots, dropping the figure after hitting them square in the heart and in the mouth. Now, as I've covered, Titanic Thompson had killed before, and he never seemed to regret these actions or feel any kind of remorse for defending himself. On the surface then, this time seemed like it wouldn't be any different. That is, until the voice from the darkness called out weakly, "Help, Mr. Thompson, I think you've killed me." As it turns out, this wasn't some random hardened criminal, but simply the young, respectful lad who had caddied his game on the golf course earlier that day. 16-year-old Jimmy Frederick then was the 5th person to die at Titanic Thompson's hands, and seemingly the first he actually regretted. However, because Jimmy had admitted to the cops before dying that he had indeed attempted to rob the other man, the local cops had no reason to press charges in relation to this crime, as again this was a case of self-defense. That being said, there was another law that Titanic might have to worry about. You see, the Mann Act outlawed the transportation of women across state lines for quote-unquote immoral purposes, which Titanic potentially put himself at risk of violating by taking the 2 young sisters from Kansas to Texas. Titanic then made a quick exit from Tyler, Texas, and soon after married the younger of the Rainey sisters, Joanne, potentially as a way of not running afoul of the Mann Act. Regardless, Titanic and the significantly younger Joanne now began traveling around the country together as they continued looking for opportunities to make money, or to be more precise, more opportunities to make money through gambling. In particular, golf courses would continue to be prime hunting grounds for Titanic Thompson, as it seems that those who still had the time and money to go golfing during the Great Depression also tended to have the kind of money they weren't afraid to wager with. During this era, Titanic would often be accompanied by one young golf pro or another who aided the gambler in winning any number of wagers. Among these expert golfing partners was future poker legend Johnny Moss, future 10-time PGA Tour winner Kyle LaFleur, and even Buddy Brainerd, the golf pro he squared off against back in California. Basically, it seems that Titanic would spot these talented young golfers and offer to take them with him on his travels, which was quite a tempting proposition, as Titanic always promised to cover whatever losses they might suffer, while still splitting their winnings 50-50. Titanic would also, while visiting the Glen Garden Country Club in Fort Worth, Texas, spot a young Byron Nelson, who, according to his Wikipedia page, is considered to be one of the greatest golfers of all time. Recognizing the young Nelson's talent, Titanic would invite the golfer to partner with him in a number of matches. Now, Nelson wouldn't stick with Titanic for long, as he would soon join the PGA Tour. But it was apparently far from uncommon for even pro golfers to play games with heavy wagers involved when not participating in the tour, as the tour's prizes in those days did not really amount to all that much. In fact, as it turns out, a number of these early PGA stars believed Titanic to have been at least on their level, if not even a little better. None other than Byron Nelson himself would say in 2006 that he was confident Titanic Thompson would have done great had he actually competed in the PGA. The thing was, as Nelson figures it, Titanic competing in the PGA would have been taking a step down, as by that point he was already playing games with $25,000 on the line, while the PGA guys were competing for $150. So, despite my continuing to take a number of these stories with a grain of salt, I do give special credence to the tales of Titanic's golf wizardry as a result of such testimony. It was also during this time that Titanic headed for Bartlettsville, Oklahoma, where he had been tipped off that the local oilmen were known to bet huge sums of money on their golf games during the day and then turn around and do the same at the poker tables at night. These were men who were clearly untouched and unfazed by the Depression, and were then perfect marks for someone like Titanic Thompson. Working together with the aforementioned future 10-time PGA Tour winner Kyle LaFleur, it sounds like Kai and Titanic, who was playing right-handed, would often manage to just beat their oilmen opponents. So, with their wealthy foes feeling like they had a chance, Titanic would not only raise the stakes, but offer to play left-handed. With the oilmen expecting their foe to play worse left-handed, they would accept this bet for even more money than they had lost the first time around. Yet what these oilmen didn't know was Titanic Thompson was actually left-handed, meaning instead of playing with a disadvantage, he now played even better than before. He wasn't done there either, as after a day of winning money from these wealthy oilmen on the golf course, Titanic Thompson would retire to the poker tables come nightfall. He wasn't done there either, as after a day of winning money from these wealthy oilmen on the golf course, Titanic Thompson would retire to the poker tables come nightfall, where he would beat the likes of John Phillips, the heir to the Phillips oil empire.